Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Excellent. Well, some of you might have heard me yesterday. There was a different presentation. Today I've got something else for you. A big thanks to Greenplast for having us here to help orientate some of your decision making in the plastics industry. So today I'm going to talk about the recycling outlook for Europe. But before I get on to this presentation, I just wanted to point out a little bit more about AMI, why we exist. We have our why. We exist to help the plastics industry navigate, innovate, and grow. And how do we do this? Is by providing business-critical information as well as networking platforms for the industry. And what exactly we bring to the market are market reports, databases, consulting services, conferences, exhibitions, and digital magazines. We have been working with the plastics industry for almost 40 years now, and these are our partner industries within the sector. Recycling and sustainability sector is very fruitful for us, and I have a fantastic team of colleagues that are really knowledgeable in mechanical and chemical initiatives, and they really helped me with putting together that presentation. My personal expertise is sort of within the rigid packaging domain, but it is now one of the most important segments to drive recycling initiatives. Okay. Good news. We have a global focus on waste at the moment, and that is through the United Nations Plastics Treaty. It's an international effort to combat plastic pollution. As of now, there are 175 nations that have agreed to adopt the treaty. And in March 2022, a historic resolution was adopted by the UN Environmental Assembly to develop a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, which will include the entire life cycle plastics, from design to disposal. These are the timelines of the sessions that were held since 2022. You may remember some more recent reports from November's summit in Busan in South Korea. This was the 5th session. The next session is planned for August in Geneva. And this is the second part of the 5th session, continuing from November last year. And the aim is to develop an internationally binding agreement on plastic pollution, including marine environment. And that summit will be preceded by regional consultations early August. Now, to sum up what those summits have brought is essentially two camps. High Ambition Coalition. These are 100+ countries, including the whole of EU, UK, and Norway. And Global Coalition for Plastic Sustainability, which includes Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, and USA. And they cannot quite agree just yet. The High Ambition Coalition aims to develop a comprehensive approach to end plastic pollution, limit upstream production of polymers, and it's not restricted to sustainable design and waste management. Whereas the Global Coalition for Plastic Sustainability has some concerns over future global environmental governance around fossil fuel and the limitations thereof. And the solutions are mainly focused on waste management and recycling, and there is no cap on plastic production. In the meantime, outside of the treaty, different countries are legislating on waste. In Europe, we started with Single-Use Plastics Directive in 2018, Now this has moved on to packaging and packaging waste regulation, PPWR. There are regulations in China, in Canada, some of the US states, in Australia, in Chile, in India. So essentially all over the world there are countries that are regulating on their waste strategies. The most optimal way to do that, however, is to review the whole waste hierarchy, and in this way we can create more meaningful progress. And the first step is essentially prevention, so reduction of usage of packaging and consumer goods. And then we go on to the reuse initiatives, recycling, recovery, and then disposal. And disposal could actually be through incineration with energy recovery, which is a separate sort of sustainability initiative that governments have to sort of adopt to move forwards. The waste hierarchy is very much reflected in the actions of extended producer responsibility. And one of those actions was the drive that was created through Ellen MacArthur Foundation. You're probably aware of it. In 2018, the signatories of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have signed the global commitment, which is following those waste hierarchy actions. You can read the reports on Ellen MacArthur's foundation on how they managed to sort of succeed since 2018. And I've got a couple of slides to sum up those actions. I appreciate it's quite small, but it's accessible in public domain. So these are the results from 2023 on how much progress the signatories of Ellen MacArthur's foundations have made. And as you can see, there's very good progress in principle on design for recycling. There is some bias on some of the big companies to do with what type of packaging they're using. So for example, if a company's in the confectionery segment, there's a lot of multi-layer flexible plastics. This is still a problem, essentially, to redesign. So the progress is really linked to how difficult the formats that those companies are using are to redesign. In terms of PCR content progress, there is significant move forward, but we're not tracking as quickly as those companies have hoped. So there are still some challenges with sourcing and financing PCR. In terms of reduction of virgin materials, it's quite odd because some companies have managed to reduce their demand and maybe moved formats and materials into paper, and some actually added virgin demand. I think those decisions are perhaps driven by cost. And then finally, in the middle, you see reuse models progress. This is an area that's still relatively untapped and will have to be addressed sooner rather than later, because there are reuse targets, reuse and refill targets that are coming from the packaging and packaging waste regulation. And I was talking about it yesterday, so if you want to know more, talk to me. That's just more of the top 20 with the same sort of progress report. You can perhaps read it afterwards. So coming back to the packaging and packaging waste regulation, essentially there are three main pillars that drive the policies. The first one is the reduction of user waste, and there are associated bans for some packaging formats coming out of the regulations. For example, the redundant secondary packaging, bans on little hotel mini shampoos and things like this. All of this has to be taken out of the market. There are some incentives to reuse as well. The second pillar is managing waste more effectively, and that initiative comes from collection and recycling policies, and also achieving recycling at scale. And the third pillar is a drive towards circular economy. And therefore, the policies around that would be to include recyclate within the packaging design, as well as drive some movement towards reusable and refillable formats. This slide just sums up the targets for recyclate inclusion. And as you can see, there are different targets coming from different materials of packaging, as well as different formats. So the regulation appreciates it's perhaps more difficult for polyolefin packaging to make that happen than it is for the PET bottles. Now, what is important here is having the recyclate inclusion targets is creating a much better environment for the recycling industry in Europe, because that creates the second market, and that market is mandated and regulated. What this also means that the prices of recycled materials will be decoupled from virgin. So on the commercial level, that is also going to help the recycling industry in Europe going forwards. Then on the other hand, the collection and recycling targets will assure that there is a better flow of feedstock for the recyclers to work on going forwards. So I think there are really positive changes ahead that will ultimately help the recycling industry in Europe, which I appreciate is struggling at the moment. All of those PPWR targets are having already a really profound impact on the demand for packaging and demand for plastic packaging in particular. So this graph shows you different segments of packaging, both rigid and flexible, consumer, industrial. The dark blue bar is now, and the light blue bar is our forecast going forwards. And as you can see, there is no more growth in those segments. In fact, there should be a reduction in the volume of plastics processed through those sectors. And that is to do with regulations, that is to do with some of the formats moving to cellulose-based solutions or durables. And there is an element of lightweighting still there, but I think we have really very much exploited that route. Now, PPR has very ambitious targets going forwards, and we still have work to do to be able to meet them. This slide shows you an estimation of what gaps we still have to be able to comply with the targets. And they include sorting capacity, mechanical recycling output, as well as chemical recycling output in Europe. So we still need 4.2 million tons in sorting capacity, which is estimated to be between 2.1 and 2.9 billion euros in capex. We still need 4.3 million tons of mechanical recycling input, and that could be anything between 4.7 and just under 6 billion euros in capex. And we still need at least 3 million tons of input capacity for chemical recycling. I'd like to zoom in into those particular segments a little bit more. And the data comes from the reports and data sets that my colleagues produce, and we have that on both mechanical recycling and chemical recycling. In fact, chemical recycling we track on a quarterly basis, so we really have first-hand awareness of how the developments are going. So that slide shows you the mechanical recycling input capacity in Europe. This year, we're estimating that to be about 12 million tons, and we still have a fair way to go. Now, the whole market for commodity polymers in Europe this year is about 55 million tons. We have estimated that the production of recyclates is just under 10 million tons, and that means the recycling rate is about 15% at the moment. So there's a long way to go. Now, what happens with those recyclates that are being produced? These are the applications, so the end markets, second markets for recyclates. You see rigid packaging really leads the way and will continue to do so through PPWR. And the main polymer that is used in a recycled format is obviously PET. Flexible packaging is still relatively small market for recyclate adoption, but there's a lot of R&D going into that segment. I've identified automotive and transport markets here as well, because there's regulation pending to drive sustainability in that segment. So there might be more initiatives, more opportunities for our industry in that segment. Okay, let's move on to the chemical recycling. And this is quite a tricky slide to explain, so I need you to focus. Okay, so this is chemical recycling input capacity in Europe. And the dark blue line was our forecast from the January 2024 report. The light blue is January 2025 report. You see that the optimism has sort of lowered. And the yellow line is the current forecast on the existing input capacity and those sites that are in final investment decision. So what you see is we're having a delta developing between what we thought the industry would, the pace at which the industry would develop within, let's say, the past couple of years, versus now. And whilst we are indeed developing, we're not developing as fast as it was hoped. And that's just drilling down into the actual volumes of input capacity. So in 2024, the actual input was 260,000 tons. This year it's almost doubled, but we still need to grow by 52% to be able to get to over 3 million that is needed for us to move forward and meet the targets. And coming back to the previous reforecast, we actually declined the pace of growth versus last year and versus what the expectation was. Now, why are we behind? So essentially we have a delay in 12 companies over 13 sites and 1 bankruptcy in that segment. So obviously there are high and rising energy costs, high and rising feedstock costs and lack of availability. The costs are therefore much higher than budgeted in the feasibility studies that were done a few years ago. That creates problems with the cash flow, and you have commercial problems for some of those investment decisions. And then on the more pragmatic side, we're seeing lack of skilled contractors to actually be able to deliver a project like this, and there are some construction delays. So these are the sources of the problems at the moment. So it is no surprise that the strategies are actually shifting for the companies that operate in the environment. These are some of the strategies that have been undertaken recently. So one of them is focusing more on feedstock. So an example would be Agilix, which has shown a shift from a developer of proprietary chemical conversion technology to an investment holding company focused on maximizing the potential of its interest in both feedstock management and waste conversion via cyclics. Some other companies like Altera Energy have focused on developing more standardized solutions. So Altera is now offering modular solutions to then help the industry in this way. Some other companies have looked at output diversification. So for example, Loop Industries is offering BHET and MEG in complement to the PET and polyester fiber manufacturing business. Pure Cycle Technologies have diversified from offering polypropylene to also compounding. And then finally, there are different strategies to manage the business model. For example, Blue Alp Holding has now expanded by not only developing the detailed design, procurement, and fabrication, but also offering licensing models for its customers. There's certainly a lot to do and try and maneuver through the context. And now, very importantly, at this point from the formal perspective, we don't yet, as far as I know, have a formalized way to account for mass balance methodology. And we've had a bit of a history with that. So initially, it came through the European Green Deal in 2019. Then it was meant to be developed in a delegated act in 2022. That didn't happen. Then ever since, the industry has been debating whether we should have polymer-only or fuel-exempt methodology to account for the mass balance. Then there were discussions around it, whether the methodology should be specified as part of Single-Use Plastics Directive or PPWR. And now, more recently, I think the motion was passed by ENVI committee, but then it was rejected by the Parliament a week later. As things stand now, we're still awaiting the final vote with a suggestion to move ahead with the fuel-exempt model of mass balance accounting. Okay, that brings me to a summary of my presentation. The key takeaways from today is that sustainability does remain very high on the agenda of both the EU and other countries. Mechanical recycling is an innovative industry and increasing its capacity. Chemical recycling capacities are also developing, but with a delayed timeline to initial forecasts. And we actually need both of these solutions to be able to meet targets going forward. And there is so much more effort that as an industry and value chain we have to bring together to move forward. And overall, the plastics recycling industry is a dynamic, rapidly evolving segment, and it holds a lot of potential for those who are involved. So I do hope that this show will give you an opportunity to shake the right hands and move your businesses forwards. And final slide here, if you're interested in some of those studies that I mentioned, that barcode will take you through to our website. I'm happy to talk to you as well if you want to. Thank you.